Chapter 24, 24 Hours in Nowhere, 4:00 p.m. Mrs. Navarro drove us back to Nowhere. With all the crutches, it was a tight squeeze in the old Malibu. She stopped the car in front of the Nowhere Market and Ostrich Farm. Mayor Handsome told me you could all have free popsicles in honor of Rossi's win. And Jessie's missing toe, added Rossi. And Gus's broken nose, said Jessie. And Matthew's sacrifice, I said. We all smiled at one another. I'll tell you who won't be getting free popsicles, Matthew said, and we snickered. Mrs. Navarro got out of the car and helped Jessie out of the front seat. The three of us didn't budge in the back. I can't move, Matthew said. I think my body just died. I know, I said. Every single part of me ached, but it somehow also felt alive, more alive than I had ever felt, and I decided I'd rather feel pain and exhaustion than whatever it was I'd been feeling day after day before last night. I finally pushed myself out of the car and helped Rossi out. What were guys doing in there? Jessie said, already standing on the front porch on one foot, two popsicles in his hands, two in Mrs. Navarro's. You weren't making out, were you? My face grew hot, and Jessie laughed. Gus, you're so red, you totally wish. I gritted my teeth. I have no interest in making out with Matthew. Mrs. Navarro looked at her watch as Matthew and I helped Rossi up the steps. I'm going to go finish up some work at the scrapyard. Be back in an hour. Jessie nodded and kissed his mom's cheek. She turned to us. Stay put. The four of us sat on the bench on the porch of the Nowhere Market in Ostrich Farm, licking our popsicles, already melting in the heat. I guess I'll be hearing all about it as soon as I get home, I said. Not me, Rossi said. My dad won't have time. I think I'll make time for this, I said. Rossi raised an eyebrow at me. How do you know? I shrugged. Just a feeling. Sorry I had to rat you guys out, Jessie said. My ma is the world's best interrogator. Matthew's throat bobbed. My mom thinks I spent the night at Beau's. Did your mom call her, Jessie? I stared at Matthew. He gripped his popsicle stick so hard his knuckles were as white as his color-drained face. Maybe he wasn't so used to it after all. Jessie grinned at him. Why would she? You weren't even with us last night. Like you said, you spent the night at Beau's. Relief washed over Matthew's face and the color returned. He took a big bite of his popsicle. You know, he said, maybe we could all sit together at lunch tomorrow. I glanced at Rossi. She had sat by herself at lunchtime all last year, but she smiled now. Okay. Jessie looked at his bright orange and red popsicle. Yeah, I could take a break from Romaro's group. He smiled at me. Make some time for old friends. He looked at Matthew. And new ones, too. Then his face fell. But Beau will be after us now, you know. I gulped. I know. He'll never forget what I did, Matthew said. Popsicle juice dripping down his hand and onto his ripped pants. I don't think he'll be happy until I pay for it. I held my hand out. We stick together. That will be our best defense. Jessie put his hand on mine. Stick together. Matthew did the same. I looked at Rossi. She stared at her hands. Maybe Rossi didn't want to be in Nowhere. Who did? Maybe all she really did need was her bike and a desolate Mexican desert. But that was still a long time away. In the meantime, stick together. She placed her hand on the pile. Maybe we'll survive 8th grade, Jessie said. We'll totally survive, I assured him. I know we will. We dropped our hands and went back to slurping our popsicles. Oh, and we have to let Louis sit with us, I said. I know he spits a lot and all, but I can't abandon the poor guy. He'd be dead in about a week. Our table has an open-door policy, Rossi said. Anyone is welcome. Our table. The wind suddenly picked up, and Matthew rubbed in his eyes. Habub's coming, he said. Habub, a violent wind blowing in summer, bringing sand from the desert. We all laughed. Popsicle juice shot out of Jesse's mouth and dribbled down his chin. You don't need to be a vocabulary expert to know what that word meant here in Arizona, and no one could resist the urge to use it when the opportunity presented itself. As I licked my popsicle, I thought about what it had been doing 24 hours ago. Had Beau really been pushing my face into the cholla? It didn't seem possible. Like another life. It really was another life. I heard snoring, and I turned my head. Both Matthew and Jessie had fallen asleep, and Matthew had his head laid on Jessie's shoulder, his mouth wide open, already dripping popsicle-tinted saliva on him. Jessie had his head laid on Rossi's shoulder with pretty much the same expression as Matthew's. Both of their popsicles were melting into big, dark, wet spots on their already destroyed pants. Rossi chuckled beside me, and I laughed softly with her. I'm going to give him my old bike, she said. What? Who? Jessie. He needs a new one. But I thought you loved your bike. I do, but I realized something today during the race while I was riding Matthew's. What's that? My old bike's a trash heap. We giggled together. Besides, she said, I'm going to need a better bike to work with if I'm going to teach you how to ride. My stomach tightened. Really? Yep. The wind suddenly picked up. A couple of our popsicle wrappers blew onto the porch and tumbled down the steps, joining the rest of the garbage that lined the roadside. Hey, what do you think is in the circle? Rossi asked. I tilted my head a little. What circle? The circle area on the map. A piece of dust blew into my eye and I rubbed at it. I have no idea. You know, no one knows for sure they found the gold in that mine. What are you saying? They might have found the gold in the cave? Perhaps, and perhaps there's still more in there. The wind blew Rossi's hair all around her face and some of it stuck to her popsicle. I laughed. Well, let's go check it out. She yawned and picked her hair away from the popsicle. Maybe another day. I nodded and grinned at her. Another day. We sat there quietly licking our popsicles. The only sounds are slurps and Matthew's and Jessie's snores. More dust blew into my eyes. Hey, Gus, Rossi said. Huh? I blinked and wiped at my eyes. Thanks for saving my life. I stopped wiping at my eyes and looked at her. You're welcome. You're quite heroic, aren't you? I shrugged. Oh, I don't know about that. I just know CPR. She smiled. You know about a lot of things. She raised her good hand. I put mine in it, and she closed her fingers over it. Even Stephen. Even Stephen. Rossie's smile vanished as she continued holding my hand. The sky suddenly darkened as the wind continued to pick up. She stared at me, her hair blowing around her. It's Loretta, she finally whispered. Don't worry, we'll get the wheels fixed before you give her to Jessie. No, Rossie laid her head on my shoulder and let out a long sigh. My motorcycle doesn't have a name. A moment later her popsicle was melting into soup in her lap. I leaned my head on top of Rossie's and gazed out at the town of Nowhere, the poorest town in Arizona and the least livable town in the entire United States. An actual tumbleweed blew across the crumbling road in front of us. In the hazy distance a giant wall of dust was heading our way. A piece of Rossie's hair swirled in the wind and tickled my face as she snored softly beside me. I breathed in deeply and smelled creosote. That meant it was raining somewhere. Felicity, great happiness, bliss.